The wind cut different at 8,000 feet. Jonas Fletcher found that out the hard way in his first November up in the Wind River Valley back in 1834. Ice crystals formed on the inside of his cabin walls. A water bucket froze solid, just 3 feet from a roaring fire. He'd built his cabin the way most mountain men did, stacked log walls, mud-chinked seams, and a stone hearth on one end. Standard fare for the Rockies. But by February, Jonas had burned through more firewood than any 3 men combined. His hands were raw from splitting logs, his back knotted from hauling them. And still the cold poured through those walls like wind through a sieve. Then spring came and the punishment flipped. The same thick log walls that failed to keep the cold out now trapped summer heat like a kiln. The cabin became a sweatbox. Sleep was near impossible. Jonas Fletcher wasn't alone. Every trapper and frontiersman trying to carve out a home in the high country faced the same brutal cycle. What worked back east in mild forests failed spectacularly in the Rockies. Here, summer days hit 90. Winter nights dropped past 30 below. One structure had to do both, and most couldn't. They just weren't built for it, and the wilderness gave no quarter. But over the next 3 years, Jonas would figure something out. Not something new exactly, but something no one had put together in quite the right way. A mix of old methods, borrowed from native wisdom, old-world builders, and trial-by-fire winters. What he discovered didn't just keep him alive, it would quietly ripple through the mountain territories, changing how men built their winter quarters. His cabins used less wood, stayed warmer through the freeze, stayed cooler through the burn, and for once gave something rare on the frontier: comfort. This is the story of that discovery, of how one man's stubborn refusal to freeze through another winter, or swelter through another summer, sparked a shift in high mountain homesteading, of a Swedish trapper with years in the Rockies, a Shoshone woman who called white men's homes ridiculous, and of a carpenter-turned-trapper who finally learned the difference between building a cabin and building one worth living in. Jonas Fletcher wasn't special. Born in Virginia in 1809, raised working timber with his father, he spent his early years apprenticing under carpenters before the lure of the fur trade pulled him westward. He joined a trapping brigade bound for the Rockies in 1833, just in time to catch the tail end of the beaver boom. His building skills put him ahead of most trappers, but he knew frame houses and milled boards, not raw log cabins. His first structure in the Wind River Valley showed it. He chose the right site: southern exposure for winter light, a cold spring nearby, timber close enough to haul without breaking his back, valley walls to block harsh winds. Every practical choice checked the right boxes. But the build? That's where the lessons began. He cut his logs in late summer, sap still running. Didn't season them. Stacked them bark on because peeling seemed like extra work. He chinked with whatever was handy: clay from the creek bank, moss from the shaded woods, even grass to plug the bigger gaps. He built his fireplace on the north wall where the ground lay flattest. Finished it all in 3 weeks, fast, proud, and painfully green. Then winter came. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried, leaving gaps no amount of patching could hold. The bark held moisture, invited rot, and made perfect homes for insects. The clay cracked with the first hard freeze and fell out. Moss dried and crumbled. Grass got pulled out by mice. Worst of all, the fireplace, built into the north wall, threw its warmth toward the coldest part of the cabin, while the living space stayed bitter. But the real problem was invisible. The cabin had no thermal mass. The stone hearth sat against the outer wall, radiating half its heat straight into the wild. The log walls, instead of holding warmth, leached it out faster than the fire could make more. On the coldest nights, Jonas could watch frost crawl across the interior walls, even with a roaring fire. And when summer returned, those same walls soaked up daytime heat and radiated it through the night, making the inside hotter than outside. He burned 4 cords of wood a month, triple what should have been enough. When summer came, he slept on the ground outside, anything to escape the heat. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't yet know what. The first real clue came in the fall of 1835. That's when an old Swedish trapper, Niels Bergström, passed through the valley and stopped at Jonas's place for the night. Niels had been in the mountains since the early 1820s. He was one of the survivors, the kind who didn't just endure the wilderness, but understood it. He stepped inside Jonas's cabin and felt the chill. "You're cold here," he said flatly. Jonas didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been," he answered. "Logs are tight. Got a good fireplace?" Niels didn't nod, didn't answer. He walked the cabin slowly, touching logs, pushing on the walls, checking chinking, studying the fireplace. Then he stepped back and shook his head. "Your cabin's built backwards." That was the first thing Niels Bergström said when he stepped through Jonas Fletcher's doorway, snow still clinging to his boots, breath steaming in the dim light. He stood there with the authority of a man who had survived more winters than most men survive summers, arms folded, eyes drifting over every seam, every shadow, every fault, as if he'd seen this exact mistake 100 times before. "You've made your fire warm the ground outside," he said, "and let the cold settle into your walls like a bear in its den." Jonas stared at him. He'd heard criticism before, plenty of it, but this was the first time someone had phrased it like a death sentence. And yet the worst part was simple. Niels was right. The winter of 1834 had been a merciless tutor. Jonas had watched ice bloom on the inside of his cabin walls, like white moss. His water bucket froze solid within arm's reach of the fire. The logs groaned at night, twisting as the temperature plunged. He'd built the cabin the way every trapper swore was correct: tight logs, mud-chinked gaps, a stone hearth on the north end. But somehow, his place felt colder inside than the valley outside. Niels didn't waste time with apologies or soft phrasing. He crouched by the hearth and tapped the outer wall with a knuckle. "You see this?" he said. "You're throwing half your fire straight into the weather. Heat moves, Fletcher. It doesn't stay put just because you want it to." He pointed. Heat radiates from hot surfaces. Heat conducts through materials at different speeds. Heat rises and escapes through high points first. And then he added the part that stuck with Jonas for months afterward. Unless you build something inside that holds the heat, the cold will take whatever it wants. Thermal mass. Jonas had never heard the phrase. But Niels explained it like a hunter explaining tracks. Slow, patient, certain. Heat needed a reservoir, a chunk of stone or brick, or anything dense enough to store warmth and feed it back long after the flames died low. Jonas had none of that. His stone hearth was placed wrong. His walls leaked like a sieve, and every log he used carried moisture and sap and all the traits of wood that wants to twist and open gaps the moment winter arrives. Jonas listened, mostly because he was too tired to argue. He had spent night after night hauling wood through snow that swallowed his boots to the ankles. He'd woken shivering even with the fire at full roar. He didn't need convincing that he'd built something wrong. He just didn't yet understand why. But Niels wasn't the only teacher the mountains sent. Later that autumn, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot passed through the valley with his Shoshone wife, Morning Crow. They stopped for trade, but Morning Crow stepped into Jonas's cabin, looked around once, and laughed. Short, sharp, knowing. "White men build houses that bleed," she said in a mix of English, Shoshone, and trader's French. "You make walls that sigh away their warmth, like old man breathing out his life." Jonas bristled. He'd already been humbled by a Swedish veteran of the mountains. Now a stranger, someone half his size, was picking apart the cabin he'd worked his hands raw to build. But he held his tongue. Something about Morning Crow's voice had the weight of experience behind it. She explained that her people didn't rely on single log walls. They built in layers, an inner skin, an outer skin, and a pocket of trapped air between. "Air that does not move," she said, "keeps warmth. Air that moves steals it." That was the second piece Jonas hadn't known he needed. Insulation wasn't just thickness. It was immobility, stillness. Morning Crow showed him how her people use mats, bark, hides, woven layers, anything that created a dead airspace. She spoke of earth lodges dug half into the ground, where soil itself became insulation. She talked of how the winter sun strikes low, how summer heat rises and gathers in high places, and how openings should be placed not by convenience, but by how air wants to flow. "In summer," she said, "let the breath of the house rise and escape. In a winter, trap it. Make the warmth stay. Let the earth below your feet be your friend, not something you throw away." Jonas sat up late that night after they left, staring at his fire, watching how the heat bent and drifted, how it curled toward the roof and faded. The words of both teachers circled him like coyotes testing a camp boundary. Niels had given him the science, hard-earned, proven through trial and error across half a lifetime in the mountains. Morning Crow had given him the instinctive wisdom, adaptation older than the cabins themselves. Jonas, for his part, had skills neither of them had. He knew wood, knew how to read grain, how to shape beams, how to use tools other trappers couldn't name. He realized he could blend all this into something better, something that would carry him through a decade of winters instead of one. There, in the flickering glow of his struggling hearth, he drafted his plan. He'd rebuild, this time with logs cut and seasoned properly. He'd strip the bark, let the moisture leave before they ever formed walls. He'd shift the fireplace away from the outer edge, let it stand inside, stone stretching out like a spine into the room, storing warmth from every burning log. He would add an inner layer, even if crude, that trapped still air. He would chink with materials that didn't crumble in frost, sand, clay, fiber, ash. He would raise the floor, lower the roof line, tighten every seam until wind had no invitation. He would build not just a shelter, but a living machine, something that partnered with the land instead of fighting it. By December, the plan was set in his mind as firm as a frozen creek bed. And in the seasons ahead, that plan would grow into something that changed the very way high country cabins were built, quietly, steadily, one warmed night at a time. Jonas Fletcher decided to rebuild his cabin from the ground up. No patch job this time. He would use everything he'd learned, the hard winters, the scorching summers, the words of old trappers and native builders, and shape a structure that worked with the mountain, not against it. The building would eat most of the next summer, but Jonas knew the payoff. A shelter that held its ground instead of blowing in the wind. In late fall of 1835, he began cutting logs. After the sap had drained, the wood settled, hardening in the cold. He felled twice the number necessary for a standard cabin. Why? Because his new design demanded double walls in key areas. He stacked the timbers through the winter, separated by spacers that let air flow between them. So the logs dried slow and steady, evenly, ready for spring assembly. When spring thawed the snow and the valley opened, Jonas began construction. The first major overhaul, foundation and floor. His old cabin had sat on packed earth, cold seeping up from every mole hole and frost fracture. This time he set the structure up on stone piers at the corners and midpoints, lifting the floor about 2 feet off the ground. That created a crawl space, air gap underneath that stopped damp, rot, and winter chill from climbing the logs. And in summer, it became a stash zone for perishables that needed to stay cool but not freeze. The floor itself was no earthen slab. It was built of split logs, puncheons laid flat over heavy beams, creating a real wood floor much warmer underfoot. The airspace underneath, plus the thickness of the wood, acted as a thermal buffer. Jonas would feel the difference instantly. Less chill coming up through his boots, less cold nights waking on a hard ground. Next came the walls. Jonas built the main shell out of large logs hewn flat on top and bottom, for tighter joints, no bark, no sap-soaked timber, each log cut and stacked slow. But then he went farther. On the north and west walls, those facing the brutal winter winds, he added an inner wall set 2 feet inside the outer. Between the skins was a sandwich of insulation, moss at the base, then packed dry leaves and forest debris, then more moss, and finally a layer of clay mixed with grass. The trapped air and materials slowed heat escape, like a dam holds back a river. The east and south walls got less extravagance. They faced the sun. But Jonas applied a special chinking formula he developed. Small split wood wedged firm between logs, then a blend of clay, sand, and cow hair. He traded with a settler for a sack of hair trimmings. The hair reinforced the mixture, stopped cracking. Sand gave structure. Clay sealed the gaps. He even mixed in a little lime, borrowed trick from a mapmaker's cabin, to harden the chinking against moisture and freeze-thaw cycles. He didn't know the chemistry, but he knew the result. Seams that stayed tight, gaps that stayed closed. Then the hearth. Instead of building the fireplace into the outer wall, Jonas positioned it 4 feet in from the north wall. Massive stone hearth and firebox built heavy. Rounded river stones and flat hearth blocks created serious thermal mass. Tons of rock inside the cabin acting as a heat battery. He built stone benches on either side of the hearth that served as seating and additional thermal mass, so each log that burned charged the room instead of dumping heat into the night. The fireplace itself included a clever twist. About 5 feet up the chimney, he built a slight bend, a trap for heat and smoke. The rising gases had to rub against more stone surface before they escaped. That meant better heat extraction. At the top, a stone damper Jonas could adjust when the fire was low, reducing heat loss, while the smoke still found its way out. Finally, Jonas tackled ventilation and seasonal flow. He cut small vents near the roof on opposite walls, east and west. In winter, they stayed plugged with fitted wood sealed in clay. In summer, he removed the plugs, and hot air rose out cleanly, pulling fresh, cooler air from the windows. Hot summer nights became bearable. While many cabins baked in July sun, his stayed shaded and airy. And the roof? He built a steeper pitch than usual, letting snow slide off quicker, rain dissipate, glare disappear, preventing water infiltration and reducing heat gain. When the new cabin stood complete the following fall, Jonas walked through the door with a sense he'd never felt before. The walls didn't seem to breathe cold. The floor felt warm under his boots. Winter night came, and his fire burned down to coals, and the cabin stayed comfortable. Summer brought 90-degree days outside, and he slept inside without waking drenched. Word spread across the valleys and ridges. Other trappers dropped by, looked at his structure, asked questions. Jonas didn't boast. He showed. He let the cabin speak. And the mountain builders began to change their tune. One cabin here, two there. The method spread, a quiet evolution. Jonas Fletcher didn't claim to have invented anything. He was a carpenter turned trapper. Born Virginia 1809, apprenticed with father's tools, lured west in 1833 by the fur rush, not by dreams of designing cabins. His first build failed him. Freeze and boil, burn wood and sweat, he learned. And in the process left a mark, because out here comfort matters. Not luxury, but survival. And when your floor holds heat, and your walls block cold, and your fire stores warmth instead of fighting wind, you built more than a cabin. You built a lifeline. The snow slid off the roof like a rock when the roof's angle was right. Jonas Fletcher learned that the hard way. So he built his next cabin to shrug off snow instead of groan under its weight. That steep pitch wasn't just about shedding snow. It carved more space between the ceiling and the roofline, an insulating air gap, and let him layer sod over split wood shingles, creating both insulation and thermal mass. He'd seen sod roofs on plains settlers, but up here in the mountains he adapted it for the high country. First he laid cedar shakes as a base, then several inches of clay, acting as a moisture barrier. Then thick soil held in place by wood frames along the eaves. Grass and wildflowers rooted in the tundra cap bound the soil together. The result, a living roof that worked. It buffered summer heat, held winter warmth, and became part of the wilderness instead of fighting it. That was only one of his major changes. The fifth element dealt with windows and the south wall. Jonas placed the main door and two small windows all on the south side to catch the low winter sun. Glass was expensive, fragile, but positioned just right. The sun's rays warmed the cabin when they reached inside. In summer, though, when the sun rode high, he built wooden awnings over the windows to shade the interior, preventing the cabin from turning into a furnace. Inside, he set stone slabs beneath each window, 3-inch thick slabs extending several feet into the room. During the day, the winter sun hit those slabs, warming them. At night, the stones released that heat back slowly. This passive solar heating married with the mass of his huge interior fireplace to cut firewood needs. Jonas could feel the difference the first time he sat in front of the hearth in autumn and watched the sun angle through the window. That summer took him almost the entire season of 1836. Other trappers watched. They raised eyebrows. Double walls seemed overkill. The interior fireplace looked odd, too massive. The sod roof drew particular skepticism. They assumed it would leak or collapse under snow. Jonas ignored the whispers. He kept chopping, stacking, trimming, raising logs, chinking. By early September, he'd moved in, still finishing details, still tweaking seals, but the shell stood. Then came the true test. October brought an early freeze. The night air dropped below zero. He lit the fireplace that afternoon, stoked it hot for 2 hours. The stone mass heated through. By evening, the fire was mere coals, and the cabin stayed comfortable. Jonas didn't need his heavy coat for the first time ever. At midnight, the fire went out. He slept. Dawn came. His breath still formed clouds, but inside, the cabin held warmth. He touched the stone hearth. It was still warm. The walls? No frost inside. The temperature had dropped, but slowly, much more slowly. Then came January, brutal and long. Nights fell to 30 below for days on end. Jonas followed a routine. Hot fire in the afternoon, strong blaze, big logs, then let it burn low overnight. The stone mass held the heat. The double walls stopped the cold from north and west. The raised floor kept icy ground from creeping in. Chinking stayed tight, no drafts sneaking through. By the end of the winter, he burned less than half the wood he had the year before. He worked inside without gloves, slept without stacking blankets. He sat in his chair and breathed air that didn't feel like a trap. The difference wasn't subtle. It was radical. Visiting trappers stared at the fire-scarred walls, the stones, the seams, and asked what he'd done. Word spread through the Wind River Valley. Other mountain men began borrowing Jonas's techniques. Some used the double wall idea. Others moved their hearths to the center of the room. Many started using his chinking recipe because it held up when old clay and moss failed. The specifics varied. Materials depended on what trees and dirt each man had. But the core principles held. By 1838, cabins in the valley bore Jonas's influence. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid cabin, double wall on the north side only, saving work but gaining insulation. A pair of brothers from Kentucky placed their stone fireplace in the exact center and built so much mass it stayed warm well over 24 hours on just one blaze. An older trapper named Samuels added a sod roof to his existing cabin and swore it changed both summer and winter comfort. Jonas Fletcher never claimed to have invented everything. He never staged speeches by the hearth or marked days for celebration. But by living the problem and refusing to accept it, by cutting logs in seasons, laying stone with intent, seasoning wood with patience, he changed how a mountain cabin could perform. On cold nights when the wind screams over ridges, when summer sun bakes high valleys, the cabins built on his principles stand strong while others shiver and sweat. And that matters. Because out here in the high country, comfort isn't luxury. It's survival. And a well-built cabin, built for the land and built for the extremes, becomes more than shelter. It becomes legacy. The summer benefits of Jonas Fletcher's design showed themselves in the hot months of 1837. While neighboring cabins turned into ovens, his structure held cool. The steeply pitched roof shed snow in winter and now proved its worth in summer, absorbing heat before it could force its way through. With the greater clearance between ceiling and roofline, an insulating air gap formed naturally. Over the Shoshone's cedar shakes, Jonas laid a thick layer of clay as a moisture barrier and then capped it with good soil held by wooden frames along the eaves. Grass, wildflowers, roots binding the soil together, turned that roof into a living quilt. The sod roof offered insulation and thermal mass. It buffered summer heat, slowed its entry, and in winter helped hold warmth inside. That was only part of the story. Jonas's fifth major improvement involved his windows in the entire south wall. He positioned the main door and two modest-sized windows facing the low winter sun, accepting fragile glass because the payoff was worth it. In summer, when the sun climbed high overhead, he protected those windows with wooden awnings to prevent interior overheating. Inside each window, he set a stone slab, 3 inches thick, extending several feet into the room. Daytime winter sunlight would warm the slab, and through evening and night the slab released that warmth slowly. It was passive solar heating in its simplest form. Couple that with the massive interior fireplace and stone mass, and the result was dramatic, far less firewood required to keep the space comfortable. Construction of this new cabin took most of the summer of 1836. Trappers passing through the valley watched in curiosity and skepticism. Double-wall construction seemed like overkill. The massive interior fireplace looked unusual compared to the standard hearth on an outer wall. The sod roof drew particular commentary. Many expected leaks or collapse. Jonas ignored the doubters. He cut logs, he stacked them, he chinked. By early September, he had enough built to move in, though he spent the next weeks fine-tuning the chinking and details. The real test arrived in October when a hard, cold snap descended across the valley. Nighttime temperatures plunged below zero. Jonas lit his fireplace in the afternoon, fed it hot for 2 hours, then let it drop to embers. Yet inside the cabin he found comfort. By evening, his heavy coat sat on a chair, unused. By midnight, the fire was out, and he slept. At dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was far warmer than it should have been. The stone hearth remained warm. The walls held no frost. The temperature had dropped, but gently. His cabin had held the line. Then came January, and with it, brutal days of 30-below temperatures. Jonas stuck to a rhythm, run the fire strong for a few hours each afternoon, then let the stone mass carry the warmth overnight. The double walls blocked the cold winds from north and west. The raised floor stopped ground chill. His improved chinking kept drafts out. The result? He burned less than half the firewood he had the previous year. Inside, he worked without gloves. He slept with fewer blankets. Comfort replaced misery. Visiting trappers asked what he'd done differently, and he told them. Word spread through the Wind River Valley and beyond. Other trappers adopted elements of Jonas's innovations. Some built double walls. Others relocated their fireplaces to interior positions for better thermal mass. Many shifted to his improved chinking mixes, rejecting the old clay and moss standard. Variation existed. A French-Canadian trapper, Remy, built double walls only on the north side to save labor, yet gain insulation. A pair of Kentucky brothers placed a massive stone fireplace dead center, claiming it held heat for a day after the fire died. An older trapper, Samuels, added a sod roof to his existing cabin and reported both summer and winter comfort gains. Jonas Fletcher remained in the Wind River Valley until 1843. The beaver trade was fading, but he had grown to love the mountains, the land that taught him lessons in frost and sun. He married a Shoshone woman, cousin to Morning Crow, and raised 3 children in that carefully built cabin. The home stood for over 40 years, surviving winter avalanches, summer heat waves, the wear and tear of frontier life. When Jonas finally moved in the 1860s to live near a child, the cabin still stood, solid logs chinking intact, stone hearth as sound as the day he built it. Settlers used it afterward, recognizing its quality. His methods were not revolutionary inventions, but practical amalgamations. Double wall construction, interior thermal mass, deep chinking, passive ventilation, all had existed elsewhere. What Jonas did was combine them for the high-altitude extremes of mountain life. The true innovation lay in seeing a cabin not as merely a box of logs, but as a system, one that played with natural heat flows, stored warmth strategically, adapted to seasonal change. He grasped heat transfer, radiation, conduction, convection, not as textbook terms, but through bitter winters and baking summers, one log at a time. Modern thermal engineering would later explain what Jonas instinctively built. Trapped air in double walls acted as insulation. Stone mass inside functioned as a thermal battery. The sod roof added both insulation and thermal mass. The elevated floor reduced ground-coupled heat loss. The ventilation options responded to seasons. Every element had purpose, even if Jonas lacked the formal language to describe it. Beyond comfort, his building techniques had broader impact. Less firewood meant fewer hours cutting wood, hours of climb, haul, backache saved. Less pressure on local timber, which was already strained. Better-built cabins likely improved health too. Fewer nights spent freezing, fewer chills, fewer winters worn down by cold. Survival in the wilderness got a little easier. And in a land where hardship was constant, small improvements meant something. And then there was the social piece. Jonas freely shared his techniques, not hoarded them. Mountain communities thrived on knowledge exchange, and his willingness to speak at the fire or show a detail to a curious trapper added to that tradition. He didn't erect a monument. He handed out lessons. In the high country, that mattered. Building a cabin that truly worked meant the difference between standing strong through winter and freezing in the dark. Out in the mountains, survival knowledge circulated freely, because every man's life depended on it. Jonas Fletcher embodied that spirit. When he learned what worked, he helped others understand it, rather than hoard secrets. Some of the trappers who picked up his methods carried them outward. A band of men who wintered in the Wind River Valley in 1838 later moved into Montana Territory and constructed cabins using his double-wall design. Settlers heading for Oregon in the early 1840s sometimes paused in the valley, visited Jonas, and absorbed instruction on cabin building. That kind of knowledge drifted along mountain trails from camp to camp, over thousands of miles, informing countless shelters. The techniques kept changing. In places where stone was scarce, builders turned to adobe bricks or packed earth for thermal mass. Where timber was limited, smaller logs and thicker insulation layers became the norm. In climates with less brutal swings, roof designs shifted. Yet the underlying principles stayed consistent. Trap the heat, keep out the cold, use materials wisely, orient for the sun, let the house breathe when it must. Jonas himself never stopped refining. In the late 1830s, he added a small greenhouse attached to the south side of his cabin, an experiment in extending his growing season and capturing passive heat in winter. He tinkered with chinking recipes. At one point, he added tallow to his mixture, giving water resistance. He even built a second stone hearth outside for summer cooking. This way, the cabin itself stayed cooler when the world outside was scorching. By the time he was in his 50s, his cabin wasn't just a dwelling. It was a local showpiece. Visitors often commented on how much more comfortable his place was than the typical log box. Some offered to buy it. Jonas always refused. He'd poured too much labor and learning into it. The cabin stood for more than shelter. It stood for accumulated experience. In the broader sweep of frontier architecture, Jonas's work fits into a larger evolution. As settlers moved west throughout the 1800s, they encountered new climates, unfamiliar materials, and unexpected obstacles. Wood that cracked, snow that piled, heat waves that baked cabins flat. Regional building styles adapted. In the Pacific Northwest's damp forests, houses rose on raised foundations and sharp-pitched roofs to keep water out. In the arid Southwest, thick adobe walls held heat back. On the wind-blasted Great Plains, settlers built sod houses, earth as both structure and insulation. Each region developed its response. Jonas's contribution sat specifically in the high-altitude mountain zone, where temperature swings were savage and winters merciless. What he created required no pricey parts or imported supplies. A man with basic carpentry tools, a pile of seasoned timber, stone from the creek, and the know-how could build it in a single summer. That meant his methods spread fast among trappers and settlers who needed practical solutions, not fancy architecture. Generations carried the ideas forward. Children raised in well-built cabins learned by example what mattered. They remembered that fewer firewood loads meant less exhaustion, that houses that held warmth kept sickness away longer. And though some of the building tradition faded, as farms took over trapping lands in the 1850s, the core principles persisted. Farmers building homes in the mountains still needed structures that would withstand frosts and fires alike. They worked with sawmills, dimensional lumber, manufactured nails. But the same truth applied. Build with climate, not against it. Modern visitors at reconstructed mountain man cabins often see a simple log box with a hearth at one end. Authentic looking, yes. But it misses the subtle sophistication of evolved designs, the double walls, the stone hearth in the center, the sod roof. The difference between a trapper's first winter cabin and the house he would build after 5 years of learning was dramatic and meaningful. Jonas Fletcher never wrote a blueprint. He didn't sign contracts. He chopped logs, tested techniques, and talked to anyone who cared to listen. The legacy he left isn't locked in archives. It's in structures that still stand, in the families that followed his methods, in the interior of cabins where warmth stayed and sweat didn't collect when outside the ridge scorched. It's in the way mountain men passed knowledge across generations, by showing, by doing, because in the end, building a cabin in the mountains was more than carpentry. It was survival. It was community. It was learning from the land, from winters, from mistakes, and turning those lessons into walls that stood firm while storms raged. And that, perhaps, is the real frontier story. Not the flags, not the battles, but the men who quietly changed the way people lived. The cabin Jonas Fletcher built in the Wind River Valley, that carefully crafted structure, shaped by frost and fire, didn't last forever. After Jonas abandoned it in the 1860s, weather and time began their work. The sod roof collapsed first. Wood, once strong and tight-fitting, began to warp and rot. By the early 1900s, only the stone fireplace remained standing, a lone monument to the part of the building built to truly endure. Even that relic finally disappeared beneath shifting soil and wild vegetation, reclaiming the land. Yet the physical structure's demise didn't mean the ideas died too. What Jonas developed and freely shared lived on. Trappers and settlers across the Rockies used techniques that can trace their roots, in part, to the lessons learned in that valley in the 1830s. The origin of these ideas became vague. Few decades later knew exactly which cabin started the pattern. But the methods still worked, and that was what mattered. The story tells us something vital about how innovation happens on the frontier. Breakthroughs often didn't arrive from trained engineers or blueprinted architects. They arose from men and women who watched failures, listened to old-timers, borrowed tribal knowledge, and experimented until something new held up. Jonas combined Swedish log-building principles, indigenous construction wisdom, and his own carpentry experience. The result exceeded any single tradition on its own. Environmental necessity drove his thinking. His first cabin? Fine for many places. But at 8,000 feet in the Wind River Valley, it was barely livable. It demanded better solutions, so he thought differently and built differently. That's innovation born of survival. The essential lesson remains clear. Buildings can be designed to work with the climate, not simply resist it. Modern green building and passive house design echo the same ideas. Use thermal mass to store and release heat. Create insulation layers to control conduction. Design natural ventilation. orient the structure for sun and shade. These weren't new ideas in the 1830s. They were survival knowledge carved into logs and stone. Jonas Fletcher didn't know the formal scientific terms for conduction or radiation. He learned through sweat, thaw, frost, trial, and success. Jonas died in 1881 at age 72, having exceeded the lifespan of many of his mountain man peers. He lived through the rise and fall of the beaver trade. He watched railroads cut through passes once trod only by game and trappers. Through it all, he remembered those brutal first winters in the valley when heat teased, wood groaned, and survival demanded more than grit. In late years, he sometimes guided younger builders who asked for advice. He'd speak of double walls, thermal mass, proper chinking, seasonal ventilation. Some listened and built accordingly. Others nodded politely and took the easiest path anyway. Jonas didn't mind. He knew people had to feel cold enough, burn too many cords of wood, and learn the hard way before they built properly. But for those who did listen, the reward was vivid and immediate. A cabin that stayed warm in winter without burning endless firewood. A home that stayed cool in summer without constant attention. A place that worked with the land rather than fighting it. That was the real innovation. Recognizing that shelter can be more than denying weather, it can actively manage it. The techniques Jonas developed and shared represented accumulated wisdom from Scandinavia, from indigenous nations, from frontline carpentry, adapted to very specific conditions through trial and error. They weren't perfect. No building method ever is, but they were significantly better than the standard approach most trappers accepted. That improvement, multiplied across dozens or hundreds of cabins over many winters and summers, became a meaningful advance in frontier living conditions. And the mathematics of that advance were straightforward, even if Jonas never did arithmetic by candlelight. His first cabin burned 4 cords of wood per month during winter. At that rate, a 6-month heating season meant roughly 24 cords, 24 days of cutting, hauling, stacking labor. His improved cabin used roughly 1.5 cords per month, about 9 cords for the season. That 15-cord difference meant 15 fewer days of backbreaking woodwork, 15 days that could be spent hunting, trapping, improving homestead, or simply resting. The lower firewood demand also meant less deforestation around the cabin site. Timber-scarce zones suffered when everyone cut recklessly. Cabins that burned less wood eased that pressure. Over time and across multiple frontiers, the cumulative effect was noticeable. Nearby forests lasted a while longer. Men didn't haul timber as far. The relationship between building efficiency and environmental impact, though not framed in those terms by Jonas, was real. Trappers and mountain men visiting Jonas's cabin often asked for the specs. He showed them logs, chinking, stone hearth details. Many scribbled notes by firelight. The method spread spillover style. One man built double walls. Another centered his fireplace. A third took the chinking recipe. Doesn't matter who first thought of it. What mattered was that they built it right. The cabin faded. The stone hearth fell. But the knowledge kept walking trails, riding horses, sitting around evening fires where men asked, "How did you do that so your cabin stayed warm while mine froze through?" How thick should a double wall be? How much mass ought the fireplace hold? What's the right mix for chinking the seams? Jonas Fletcher never handed out numbers like an architect with blueprints. He believed the exact measurements mattered less than grasping the principle beneath them. One cabin builder might use an 18-inch gap between inner and outer walls. Another, with time and timber, could go 30 inches and still be just fine. The fireplace mass needed to be serious, but what that meant depended on the cabin's size, the stone available, and the budget of labor. And the chinking recipe? It changed with clay, sand, moss, grass, whatever the valley floor offered. That flexibility was the secret to the technique's spread. If Jonas demanded exact specs, log lengths, stone tonnage, lime percentage, many trappers would shrug and keep frost biting their bones, but by teaching why these design elements mattered, trap air for insulation, store heat in mass, seal gaps to stop draft, elevate floors to cut off ground cold, he empowered others. A trapper in a distant mountain, Draw could take those principles and apply them. His climate differed, his timber was smaller, his stone scarce, but the logic still worked. Real life mattered. Jonas's improved cabin took most of a summer of 36 to raise, solo work. That was significant. Trappers needed to set lines, haul pelts, survive frost and snow. To spend the full build season on one structure required sacrifice. Jonas often saw other men build in stages. Summer 1, they'd throw up logs and basic roof. Summer 2, the walls got chinking. Summer 3, the stone hearth and refinements. The cabin stood then. Not perfect, but practical. Jonas told them again and again, if you fix nothing else but 3 things, your comfort doubles. Proper chinking to stop drafts. Move the fireplace inside the insulated envelope so its mass works inward. Raise the floor to break contact with frozen ground. Each of those could be done fairly quickly. The double walls, saw roof, sod cap. Those were bonus refinements, big gains, but only once the essentials worked. Construction season was short in the high country, from June to September, sometimes less. Work fast, get weather tight by winter. Jonas recommended this order: foundation and floor first, then walls, then roof. If you never get to the roof's second skin this year, fine. Plug windows, cover gaps, live in it next winter, then refine as next spring opens. That approach made cabins buildable when time is crushed. Tools? Basic. A good axe, a saw, a bit drill or auger, a draw knife for shaping logs, a shovel. That's it. No steam-powered mill. No imported nails. Stone for the hearth came from the creek or hillside. Logs right out back. Clay, sand, moss, or grass gathered. Lime? Optional. If you had it, great. But substitution worked. That meant any trapper could adopt the system. And how did trappers learn it? Not in lectures. At rendezvous festivals, annual meetings of men returning from lines, they swapped furs and tall tales. Yes, but also cabin tips. One man said, I moved my fireplace to the center and spent half the wood, and others asked how. They passed hacks, experiments, successes. Women contributed too. Women in mountain settlements, native and settler, had voices in these designs. How the cabin cooked, stored food, slept, lit a lamp, ventilated smoke. Morning Crow's tradition of double-skinned shelters. Settler wives' ideas about layout and daylight. These shaped cabins even when record books didn't note names. Kids raised inside warm cabins could study winters instead of hiding beneath blankets. Those small gains stacked up. Health improved. Schooling could happen indoors. Quality of life rose. By the mid-1840s, as wagon trains rolled through along the Oregon Trail and the West filled with settlers, some newcomers paused with trappers and asked, how did you build so well up here? They learned. They took those practices with them. Double walls, interior massing, raised floors, passive airflow. Homesteads replaced simple trapper cabins. Larger footprints, more rooms, but the principles scaled. Bigger houses needed more mass, deeper chinking, better orientation. But it was the same foundation. Build with the climate. Economics mattered too. A cabin that burned half the wood saved tens of cords over a decade. That's tens of days cut down. That's time on trap lines, on ranch work, on recovery rather than hauling. Less wood harvested meant forests near camps lasted longer. Less back-breaking labor. Fewer colds, fewer drafts, fewer nights brittle from cold. A comfortable cabin didn't feel like luxury, it was survival. Jonas's improved cabin painted that reality. When his first version required 4 cords of wood a month in winter, that meant 6 months heating at roughly 24 cords. At 1 cord a day of work, that's 24 days of hauling, felling, splitting. His upgraded home used maybe 1.5 cords a month, about 9 cords over 6 months. That's only 9 days of labor instead of 24. 15 days saved. 15 days free to trap, explore, mend fences, read, rest. That mattered. The figures spoke plain. Finish your build right. Save your labor, lengthen your season. When trappers asked Jonas for the exact plan, he'd shrug and show them logs, chinking, hearth, then say, choose sizes, choose stone, build what you can, so long as you respect the logic. It's why his ideas traveled fast. They didn't demand perfection. They demanded understanding. They demanded adaptation. Jonas died in 1881, age 72, a long run for a man of the mountains. He'd watched an era collapse and a new frontier rise. But he carried lesson after lesson. The high mountain cabin doesn't fight the weather. It uses it. Shared knowledge made a difference. Men stopped hating winter, stopped hauling endless wood, and built smarter. His cabin is gone. The sod roof rotted. The logs collapse. The stone hearth is dust. But the design lives. Wherever a house breathes less wind, burns less wood, stands stronger through storms. That's the frontier legacy. That's the building logic he left behind. After years of battling a cabin that stayed cold, drafty, and unwelcoming, the experience of warmth and comfort was more than survival. It was a real improvement in quality of life. Jonas Fletcher wrote in letters back east that his new cabin felt like a real home rather than just a shelter from the elements. That difference, being able to relax, to sit by the hearth without shivering, to feel the walls holding warmth instead of leaking it, had value beyond mere survival. The technical know-how he developed became a kind of wealth, something you could trade, share, borrow. A trapper known for building good cabins might offer up building help in exchange for other goods or services. Settlers, new to the mountain country, would seek out experienced builders for advice. In those wild places, the knowledge itself had currency, social currency. Jonas helped younger trappers improve their cabins over the years, building friendships and alliances that proved valuable in the isolated mountain environment. The story ends not with Jonas's death in 1881, but with the ongoing use of the principles he helped spread. Modern builders interested in energy efficiency or state-of-the-art climate-responsive design are rediscovering the same techniques: passive solar design, thermal mass, insulation strategies, natural ventilation. These aren't new ideas. Mountain men in the 1830s grasped them intuitively. Jonas may never have used the term gyroscopic stabilization for bullets or R-value for insulation, but he understood the concepts through direct experience. His key insight: buildings should be designed to work with their environment, not just resist it. Understand how heat moves, how materials behave, how seasons change, how wind flows, and you build something that isn't just shelter, but tool for life. Jonas Fletcher learned those lessons the hard way, after freezing through his first winter in a poorly built cabin, after watching his firewood pile climb and his back ache with hauling loads. But he looked at what failed. He observed how heat escaped, how walls breathed cold, how wet logs rotted, how drafts carried away his warmth. He listened to a Swedish trapper's log-building wisdom, to a Shoshone woman's house-sage knowledge of insulating layers, to his own carpentry instincts. He combined those sources, experimented, built, refined, then he shared. The result? Knowledge that spread through mountain communities and shaped frontier dwelling for generations. That's the real story, not just one improved cabin in the Wind River Valley, but the accumulation and sharing of building knowledge that made frontier life more livable and sustainable. Jonas Fletcher wasn't the only problem solver. He was one of many, but his approach, observe carefully, learn from mistakes, combine diverse sources, apply principles rather than rote techniques and share the results, remains potent. The cabin that started it all, double walls, massive stone hearth, sod roof, raised floor, may be gone, fallen to rot and time. But the knowledge it represented, how to build a home that stays warm in winter, cool in summer without burning through wood or hauling endless logs, lives on. It moved through trappers, settlers, through mountain valleys and wagon trails. It guided homesteaders building family houses, influenced ranch families, even echoes in modern energy-smart homes. Jonas Fletcher likely never imagined his building methods would be discussed nearly 200 years later. He was just trying to stay warm, to build something comfortable in a harsh place. But in solving his personal problem, he made a contribution lasting far beyond his cabin. A legacy of building smarter so survival wasn't just possible. It got a little bit easier. The signs of that living knowledge are subtle. A double wall tucked behind chinking, a stone hearth placed off the outer wall, a raised floor blocking cold ground chill, a roof whose materials shed snow and stored heat. When you walk through a well-built cabin in the mountains and feel the difference, you're walking through that legacy. Jonas Fletcher's name may not be carved in logs or plaque, but the cabins he inspired still stand quietly resistant in the winds and storms that once defeated lesser shelters.